Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Brendan Hauser with EVOQ Bike. Special guest that you all know, Landry Bobo. We have a new format for this video that I'm super excited about. Landry has been posting a lot of these images on Instagram of pro workouts, and through these threads has seen some really cool stuff coming out of the UAE team and their training. And we want to talk about a bunch of different workouts that this video, you're going to take away things that you can apply to your training. When would you do these? Why wouldn't you do these? Spoiler alert, if you're not riding 30 hours a week, some of the stuff doesn't apply to you, right? So we're going to boil down what, as amateur riders, can we take from the pros, and then why are they doing what they're doing, and what's our hypothesis on that? So let's just jump right into this. And I kind of want you to lead the charge here as you've come up with a lot of this. The first one, though, we've talked about zone 2 training in so many different videos, and there's a lot of different theories on this. One big thing that we've always told our athletes is try to avoid coasting. Like if you're out there pedaling, actually go pedal your bike. But when you first said the first bullet point of zone 2 training in the UAE camp, what's sticking out as something different, or how are they approaching this?
Yeah, so one big thing I've noticed is they ride their zone 2 a lot harder than many pros usually have in the past. So I've been similar to Keegan, I'm kind of obsessed with Strava, and I've been stalking professional riders training on Strava for 12 years or something, ever since pros started posting their data on Strava. And so one trend that I've noticed, particularly at UAE, is they're riding their zone 2 a lot harder than they used to. In fact, a lot of times pro riders would ride in like zone 1 for hours on end. So they'd be riding at 50% of FTP for 7 hours. And now we're starting to see at UAE and other teams that they're riding a lot harder, more towards like 60, 65, even 70% of FTP, much higher in the zone, is one thing we've noticed. And then just cutting out the junk miles. So two of the big guys that post their data from UAE on Strava is Brandon McNulty and Pavel Sivakov, and they both have basically the same exact training programs, and they are going out and smashing. There's no coasting. It is just on the pedals the whole time, and that is quite the contrast to a lot of more traditional pro training, where they'd kind of just go out and cruise with their buddies for 6 hours and just cruise at 50% of FTP. So it seems like it's getting much more regimented with the zone 2.
It's interesting to hear guys like Garen Thomas, who said he doesn't want to ride, I think, with Sivakov because it's just on the gas, and that's not how he's used to training. And it's going to be interesting. These like people in their lower 20s versus guys in their 30s. It's the normal vanilla training is very different all of a sudden. What do you think some of the benefit, or why has this change taken place?
I think obviously, like anything, the more time goes on, the better you get at something. So things just evolve. So, I mean, also our training is evolving and we're learning continually how to do things better. So now that we have power meters, we can actually see versus 20 years ago, hey, probably coasting down this descent for 40 minutes isn't really doing much for you. Go do this flatter route and keep it on the pedals the whole time. And that's just something that I've always thought whenever I've been looking at pro riders training. Not that they didn't know what they were doing, obviously, but I've always wondered, like, why does it seem like they do so many junk miles? And so it is really interesting to see them kind of evolving their training to something that makes a lot more sense.
Define junk miles. Sorry to jump in there. Define junk miles for someone who might not know what that means.
Well, maybe not junk miles. I guess when I think of junk miles, I think of somebody who's just going out and like sprinting up every hill and coasting and not even training endurance.
Okay.
I guess more what I mean is like not very focused. So they would go out and just ride at 50% of FTP and like coast all the descents and stop for coffee for an hour. And now it's Pavel Sivakov is going out for 5 hours, like at 300 watts with like no coasting.
Mm-hmm. There's something about that no coasting, just the consistent pressure on the pedals. I do miss now being in this area in North Carolina where it's very hard to have a 4 hour ride where I just go and stay on the gas. I mean, there's always 10 to 15% descents where you can't pedal. And so, yeah, maybe I need to do some choosing of going down to the valley every once in a while just
Yeah.
to be able to ride it full gas. Any other things, maybe any like physiological things that you can think of? Maybe like fiber types or fat burning is still a keyword, buzzword that we hear kicking around. Any other reasons or theories why they might be doing this?
Yeah, so one big thing is only at least this is just my theory, and ultimately I think all of it's theoretical because I don't think we have any studies on this that can say training at 65% of FTP is better than training at 55% of FTP. That could be a really interesting study. So if you cruise at 50% of FTP, it feels like you're barely even pedaling. Cruise at 65 or 70, you can feel more tension in the legs. And whenever I'm pedaling at that intensity on the trainer for 5 hours straight, like I have the tendency to do, I just envision like just that constant tension on those type 1 muscle fibers and just building the mitochondrial density and just those consistent steady reps to build a base. So my main theory is that it's just more effective for building that engine and the mitochondria. So
What about any drawbacks to this?
the obvious drawback would be it's a lot more fatiguing. So, especially, I think this is much more an issue for people who can ride a lot, but for pro riders who can train 20 plus hours a week, there's a risk of burning out. So, obviously, riding, especially for these guys, their zone 2 is 300 watts, and you're burning 1100, 1200 calories an hour just to hold that power. So, I think in some sense, 65% of FTP is more taxing for a pro rider than it would be for, say, a Cat 4, just because the calories you're burning is so much higher. So for someone who's riding a lot, if you're doing this higher zone 2, like fueling is super important. And I think that's probably a reason why pro riders are actually able to sustain this intensity of training, is because Jack Haig talked about this on the podcast and many other pro riders have talked about this, but they were underfueled for so long because of that old school mindset of just, going out and riding on a banana and 2 almonds and then eating salad when you get back. And now you got guys crushing 150 grams of carbs per hour. And I think that is what is allowing people to actually achieve this optimal zone 2 intensity and sustain these higher power outputs. Whereas they couldn't in the past because they weren't eating enough. At least that's one of my theories. So I think as long as you're able to fuel it, the fatigue is much less of a concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is definitely a noticeable difference in when you are well fueled versus not for zone 2. It's those days where you feel like there's no chain versus the days where you would have to grit your teeth to hit 70% FTP. And just then, obviously, having the carbs on board is going to help speed up your recovery so you can do more training month after month after month, year after year. Yeah, it's just the evolution. As you said, people are getting stronger, literally. So, okay, so higher zone 2 training. Next up, we've talked at length about the benefits of low cadence, a high torque video. You've seen, was it some 5 by 10 minute sessions, or what's going on here in UAE with the high torque?
Yeah, it seems like 5 by 10 minutes is the common one. I've seen a few shorter ones at higher power, but it seems like it's 5 by 10 minute low cadence is a really common one that they do throughout the year.
Around what power? Or
It's
does it vary?
low tempo, but I think they do it by torque because sometimes I'll see one effort's at like 370 watts, which would be probably like tempo zone and 50 RPM. And then there'll be another one that's at 340 and 42 RPM. So I don't even know. I think they do it by a specific torque value rather than power, but usually it ends up being like 50 RPM, tempo zone, 5 by 10, which sounds really painful.
Why do you think they would do this? We've talked at
Yeah.
length. What's the benefit?
Um, so for guys like McNulty or Sivikov, I think it's just muscular endurance. I mean, if you think about it, if you can do 5 by 10 minutes at 50 RPM and tempo power, everything's going to feel a lot easier. So when you're in the third week of a grand tour and you're going up a 45-minute climb in the Giro, just having the legs to be able to keep going, I think that this is super beneficial. And anybody who's done torque training can speak to this. So if you're someone who's doing gravel or these long endurance type events, this could be a really good session for you. The other main thing for more of the climber GC type rider is the fiber type conversions. So converting those fast twitch type 2 fibers to aerobic type 1 fibers, and just kind of building that aerobic engine as much as possible.
Yeah, the torque training we've probably talked about in the video. Any athlete that has done, I shouldn't say any athlete or every athlete, many of the athletes that do it report the feeling of, I just have another gear. And not only after session to session, when you're doing other types of training, like you do the torque training and then threshold feels easier. But in that same session, as I'm building back fitness, I did torque yesterday. And after that, pedaling what normally I would pedal like 260 watts, I was just humming at 290. I'm thinking, damn, this feels so easy. And you're just, it's amazing. Torque training is phenomenal. So I'm curious to hear more about this next one, 3 by 60 minute aerobic threshold VT1. First off, how long of a ride is this overall that they normally do this on? And define what's aerobic threshold / VT1 for someone who's unfamiliar with this, and maybe try and put it in like ballpark percentage of FTP.
Yeah, so this is one they do all the time, like at least 1 day per week, oftentimes 2 days per week. And it's a 5-hour ride. They warm up, they do 3 by 60 minutes at aerobic threshold or VT1, LT1, which I'll define in a bit. But they will do 3 by 60 minutes of that with like 5 or 10 minute rest in between. So basically high zone 2 intervals. And so, and it's a 5-hour ride. I don't know if I mentioned that, but aerobic threshold, VT1, LT1, whatever you want to call it. If we're thinking about the, well, I guess it doesn't matter. It's basically the top end of zone 2. So for most people, it's going to be around 75 to 80% of FTP, but there's really no way you can know that for sure without lab testing. But basically, the way you can think of it is it's the highest point of aerobic efficiency. So it is where you can consume the most oxygen per breath that you take in. So every time that you breathe in, you're breathing in air, which contains oxygen, and your mitochondria have to extract the oxygen out of the air that you're breathing in. And so basically, it means that your mitochondria can extract the most oxygen per breath that you're taking. So it's really useful for building that aerobic efficiency. And then kind of, again, what we talked about earlier, that is like kind of the maximal recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers without going into tempo zones. So John Wakefield talked about this a long time ago on the podcast, but we're really trying to stimulate that mitochondrial growth. So this is just like that, getting the engine revved up and just keeping it there and just building that mega aerobic engine. And if you've done this kind of a session, you can definitely speak to how useful it is for building just that diesel engine. And I know Keegan's also a big fan of this type of training.
That's awesome. That was a really good breakdown. It was a lot of those tidbits made me think of John Wakefield because he has some posts about this and videos on YouTube. And it's interesting to see this kind of along the specific interval session to the first point, like this high zone 2, which I think, 3 years ago, everyone's like, oh, don't ride that hard. It's got to be very polarized. And there's variety. Do they do this all year long, or is this just in season or round the clock?
They do this all year. Like doesn't matter if it's base season, in the middle, in between races. Like this is seems to be something that they do all the time.
I think there's one thing that I will say that in coaching athletes and then hearing what other like pro coaches and pro athletes are doing, I came up, my first coach had me train a lot of these like low tempo efforts coming out of winter into spring. And then there was the, oh, don't do this, it's riding too hard. And I don't know, I always felt really strong from that. And not necessarily 3x60, but I remember doing some 2x40s. And it's something that I think I might really sprinkle in again. I don't know if it'll come in this season as I'm trying to get ready for races, but just like you said, building that diesel engine, there's nothing like just staying on the gas at a slightly uncomfortable pace.
Uh-huh.
So, what about high intensity? We're talking a lot of almost like base type stuff. What are you seeing in terms of high intensity sessions, if any?
Yeah, their high intensity is really controlled. So it's usually 1 or 2 days per week. And the high intensity is really simple. So it seems like there's kind of three categories of sessions they do. They have more of a lactate clearance session, which is basically over unders. They have like a 40-20 on off session, which you might have seen on Instagram, and then more of just like a simple hill repeats, kind of like Steven Seiler type workout. And it seems like it's very much more targeted towards the physiologic adaptation rather than race specificity. So I don't really, when we talk about race specific training, I never see them do any race specific training. And it's the high intensity is just this very targeted um, sessions that are really trying to stimulate whatever they're trying to train physiologically.
Do you know, not to put you on the spot, 40-20s, how many of these are they doing? Or like, what would you ballpark if someone's trying to think of like total time, or is it like 3 sets of whatever? Do you know off the top of your head if you can remember?
So all of these high intensity sessions, they are going to be total around about 30 to 60 minutes of high intensity. The
Whoa.
40 the 40-20s are a little bit of a different variation. So we think about kind of the traditional 40-20s is just like 40 seconds hard and then 20 seconds like zone 1. And then this one is 40 seconds hard, but then the 20 seconds is like actually in tempo. So it is really hard to recover. I actually tried literally just one of these intervals but one time, and it was really hard because I'm used to like letting off the gas on those 20 seconds, but you have to really keep it going. So you probably won't even be able to do that interval for more than like 8 minutes. So it'd be like 3 or 4 by 8 of the 40-20s.
Okay. And when you say a Seiler type workout, like a 4x8 minute super threshold?
Yeah, I've seen 4 by 8, 3 by 10, where it's basically just as much power as you can do for those intervals. So just really good session for training, and also VO2 max, just like a really solid aerobic session.
Any other tidbits? Any like big mega rides, crazy volume? How do they look at those, or what's their training showing?
Yeah, this is another big one, is they are not doing crazy volume. So traditionally, a lot of pro riders, they'd be out doing 30-hour weeks. Sometimes they go on top of the volcano and they're doing 30-hour weeks, just mega 7-hour rides. And in the UAE campus seems to be much lower intensity, and it's just more focused on consistency. So if we look at McNulty's base season, it's like 20 hours a week consistently every week, and then he's just hitting like all the workouts that we talked about. And they also almost never train longer than 5 hours, and that is a huge change compared to a lot of training that we've seen in the past and that we still see a lot of other riders doing. Is it's just 5 hours really controlled.
How would we address all of this to the amateur? I think it's good for them to hear that you don't have to be aspiring to 30 hours a week. I think some people think that they can't get fast on even 15 hours a week, which is crazy. You definitely can. What what would you say is applicable to the amateur and
Mhm.
what's maybe not?
This particular training, I think, is probably the most applicable to an amateur out of any pro style of training that I've seen because of how focused and dialed it is, in the sense of maybe these guys are consistently hitting that 20 hours a week and that's like maximizing their time. But even if if you have kind of just started the structured training or you're looking to switch up your training, if you are consistently training in this way and your main goal is to just build fitness overall, I think you can get really strong with a program like this. So um, it would just look a little bit different. You probably wouldn't be riding 20 hours a week, but I think these styles of sessions could be really effective for a lot of riders and are really going to help someone make the most of their training time.
Yeah, I think it's easy for riders to think, oh, I've got to be doing all this VO2 max, or I've got to be super polarized, or and the complete other side of the campus, I've got to be doing 3 low threshold sessions a week. Like, I got to be banging my head. No, like if you mix all this together, instead of thinking all these this or this, start thinking of you
Yeah.
can get the long tempo ride in. You can ride a little bit of high zone 2. You can get a quality VO2 session. And then maybe the other stuff is just endurance. But there's so many ways to get fast. It doesn't have to be crazy complicated. And I like that this is pretty simple, accessible, and we're not telling you, hey, you got to go ride 20 hours a week to get faster. So,
Yeah.
any other closing notes for the listeners on ways that they can utilize these tidbits from UAE?
Yeah, I like what you said about kind of training a little bit of everything, because that's kind of the thing that I think about with this training is they have sort of the foundational pieces of like, you need to have strong legs, so we're going to do torque training, and you need to have the aerobic base, so we're going to do these aerobic threshold rides, and then we need to translate that into the top end with this targeted high intensity. And so I think it's just a really balanced program. And I think for an amateur rider, that's really important, especially if you have 10 hours a week to train. You don't want to just be doing zone 2. You don't want to just be doing VO2 max. You want to make sure that you have like all of those foundational pieces.
Awesome. All right, everybody, good luck with your training. If you need help, hit us up for coaching options. If you need a training plan, check out our store online and email us with questions, Landry at evoke.bike or Brendan at evoke.bike. Talk to you guys soon.